Something has changed in American trucking, and most drivers cannot tell you the week it happened. The freight gets covered. The lots still fill up at night. From the outside, the industry looks the way it always did. But talk to someone who has run the same lanes for 20 years. They will not start with rate charts. They will tell you the truck payment stayed the same while the settlement got smaller, that the insurance renewal went up with no claim and no explanation, that the load board, which used to fill by lunchtime, now shows the same 3 loads at 4 in the afternoon. And they say it flatly, the way people talk about weather, like something shifted and nobody bothered to announce it. American trucking generated about $906 billion in revenue in 2024, down from roughly $1.004 trillion in 2023, a drop of about 9.8%. An estimated 88,000 carriers and 8,000 brokers shut down in 2023. Federal authority data show a further net contraction of nearly 10,000 motor carriers in just the first half of 2024. The industry still moved 11.27 billion tons of freight and employed 8.4 million people, including 3.58 million drivers. Same trucks, same drivers, less money. There was no single failure, no shutdown, no warning anyone acted on. Just steady pressure, year after year, state after state, until the math stopped working in different places for different reasons. These are 8 states where drivers are already naming it out loud, and the further down this list we go, the harder it gets to explain away. Number 8, Indiana, 7 in the evening, an interstate exit east of Indianapolis. Every space in the lot is taken. The on-ramp shoulder has 4 rigs on it. There are 50 minutes left on the clock. Nationwide, there are about 313,000 truck parking spaces, public rest areas, and private truck stops combined for roughly 3.5 million trucks. 1 space for every 11 trucks. That math is the reason a legal driver becomes an illegal driver at sunset. Parking ranks as the top driver concern in the industry's annual survey and the second highest issue overall. Not detention, not rates, not insurance, places to stop. Indiana sits at the crossing point of Interstate 65, Interstate 69, Interstate 70, Interstate 74, and Interstate 94. Freight density is set by geography. Parking supply is set by land use and local zoning. The state inventory documents 15,943 spaces total, 12,725 private, 3,218 public. 48.7% of locations have 15 or fewer spaces. 17.2% have 5 or fewer. The modeling identifies 57 grid cells already in parking shortage, 188 cells with measurable truck demand and no official parking at all. Not zero parking because nobody drives there. Zero parking because nobody zoned for it. A driver inside the last hour of the clock has 2 choices: park somewhere that is not a parking space or drive past the limit. Only one of those 2 shows up on a roadside inspection report. Paid parking in Indiana averages about $16.50 per night per space where it exists. The math is simple. A space costs money, land costs money, zoning takes time. Freight moves faster than infrastructure committees meet. The problem is not distributed evenly. It concentrates where freight concentrates. The worst-hit states run shortages more than double the national average. The clock is the one thing a driver cannot negotiate. The next state takes something that costs just as much and never shows up on an invoice. Number 7, Ohio. 10:45 appointment at a large distribution center outside Columbus. Checked in on time. Doors opened after 2 in the afternoon. Engine idling the entire time for climate and lights. Diesel ran between roughly $3.66 and $4.06 per gallon through 2024. 3.5 hours. Burning fuel. Burning clock. Appointment systems are built around the receiver's labor schedule. The driver's 14-hour window absorbs the difference. Full electronic logging compliance arrived in December 2019. Hours of service revisions followed in May 2020. That absorbed time is now documented precisely, still largely uncompensated. Detention pay exists in many contracts. Capped, starts late, requires proof the shipper controls. The incentive to load faster is weaker than the incentive to schedule loosely. A driver who arrives early cannot check in early. A driver who arrives on time waits on the receiver's timeline. The cost of that wait is measured in fuel, in hours, and in loads, not taken because the clock ran out. Some analysts argue the trucking downturn is partly a delayed side effect of COVID relief. Cheap emergency loans helped launch thousands of small carriers. Tens of billions of dollars flooded the market. When demand cooled, competition intensified. The rate collapse prolonged. More trucks, same freight, weaker rates. A carrier who could have walked away from a low-paying dedicated contract in 2019 cannot walk away in 2024 because there is nowhere better to walk to. Therefore, the receiver's schedule becomes the carrier's cost. The wait becomes the driver's problem. The fuel becomes the operator's line item. The contract says detention after 2 hours. Further north, an entire freight base is built on a promise that looks even safer, right up until it isn't. Number 6. Michigan. Freight payment data recorded a 10.9% linked quarter collapse in shipments in late 2023. Average quarter-over-quarter declines ran about 7.4% through the first quarter of 2024. Dedicated manufacturing work trades rate upside for predictability. A carrier commits equipment. A plant commits volume. The contract is written around steady lanes. When a plant slows a shift or resequences component inflows, the carrier's revenue drops without any load being formally canceled. The truck is still committed, just not moving. No detention clock starts because the truck is not at a dock. No breach notice is filed because no shipment was scheduled. The equipment sits. The driver waits. The fixed cost runs. Tariff pressure on components changes lane geometry rather than volume alone. A part sourced from a different country arrives through a different gateway. The domestic leg that used to be a steady round trip becomes a one-way with a weak backhaul. The carrier still runs the lane. The margin is gone. Dedicated freight is sold as safe work, stable only while the customer's own demand is stable. The operator carries the equipment either way. The plant is not lying when it says demand is down. The carrier is not exaggerating when it says the contract does not cover this. Both statements are true. Industry researchers argue the widely promoted driver shortage narrative is largely a myth. Heavy-duty driver employment has not significantly declined since 2020. The narrative says there are not enough drivers. The data says there is not enough freight. A plant that ran 3 shifts in 2021 runs 2 in 2024. A carrier that added tractors for that 3rd shift still owns those tractors. In the next state, the equipment is not the problem. The load itself goes missing. Subscribe to see how industries collapse from the inside, through the people who see it first. This series documents crises most channels won't touch. Number 5. Missouri. A driver arrives at a shipper on the Interstate 70 corridor for a mid-morning pickup. Load number confirmed. Appointment confirmed. Paperwork matches. The freight left the night before, hauled away by a truck with the right paperwork, the right load number, and someone else's authority on the door. Rapid churn in operating authority makes vetting harder. A dormant authority with a clean history can be bought, retitled, and used to book real loads. The paperwork looks legitimate because it is legitimate. The carrier named on the load confirmation exists. The problem is that the driver who showed up does not work for that carrier. The shipper releases the freight. The broker pays the imposter. The freight disappears. The shipper claims against the carrier of record. The carrier's cargo policy carries a deductible. The small operator who never touched the freight can still spend months proving it. Theft becomes an accounting problem before it becomes a police problem. Most freight moves without incident. The fraud that does occur concentrates where verification is weakest and turnover is highest. A broker closes, a new broker opens. The vetting process assumes continuity that no longer exists. The carrier who lost the load argues they were not the carrier who picked it up. The shipper argues the load was released to a truck with valid credentials. The broker argues the carrier they hired had clean authority. Nobody in that chain is lying. The freight is still gone. The loss is real. The liability is disputed. The small carrier pays the deductible, pays the lawyer, and waits. The imposter is gone. The freight is gone. On the coast, the freight shows up on time, in volumes nobody can use. Number 4. South Carolina. Shipper spending fell 27.9% year over year and 16.8% quarter over quarter in the first quarter of 2024. The demand side of drayage, quantified. Import timing is decided by buyers hedging against future costs. Boxes arrive early in a rush, 3 weeks of surge volume. Drayage capacity expands to meet the rush. Tractors added, chassis commitments signed, drivers hired. The volume normalizes. The capacity stays on the balance sheet. A surge is sold as good news for local carriers. The surge pays for weeks. The equipment is paid for over years. Terminal congestion during the peak means fewer turns per day exactly when rates are best. A carrier who could run 4 turns in normal conditions runs 2 during the surge. The rate is higher. The volume per truck is lower. The peak ends. The added equipment remains. The payments remain. The carrier who expanded into the surge now competes with every other carrier who did the same. A drayage operator cannot move the equipment to a different market without leaving the port work entirely. The tractor is useful. The chassis lease is port-specific. The driver knows the terminal. The freight is 2 miles from the gate to the warehouse. The margin was thin during the surge. The margin is gone after. A local carrier who refuses the surge loses the relationship. A local carrier who accepts the surge owns the cost when it ends. Further south, a single envelope in the mail does what a bad quarter cannot. Number 3. Florida. A 1-truck operation opens its renewal quote. Premium moved by a 4-figure monthly amount. No claims, no violations, no change in operating radius. The operator starts pricing which coverage to reduce. Premiums are priced off the tail of litigation outcomes across a whole state, not off one operator's record. A small carrier is underwritten by other people's verdicts. Settlement pressure rises even in defensible cases because trial cost exceeds the value of being right. The insurer settles. The premium pool absorbs it. The operator who never had a claim pays for it. Renewal is the month when a marginal operation quietly discovers it is no longer viable. No announcement, no bankruptcy filing. The authority goes inactive. The truck gets listed. The insurer describes the premium as actuarially sound given loss trends. The plaintiff attorney describes the settlement as necessary given permanent injury. 2 accounts of the same cost. Neither party carries it. The operator who can afford the new premium continues. The operator who cannot does not. A carrier with thin margins in a strong market has no margins in a weak one. The premium increase is not the cause. It is the bill that cannot be paid. Which of these mechanisms has hit you personally? Drop a comment and name the state. And subscribe if you want the rest of the countdown, because 2 and 1 are where the bill stops being something you can negotiate. Number 2. Arkansas. A routine inspection at a weigh station on the Interstate 40 corridor. Documentation check. Language proficiency check. 40 minutes later, the outcome is not a fine, but an out-of-service order. Loaded trailer sitting on the scale. Enforcement discretion is applied at the roadside. The consequence lands on the carrier's safety record and on the shipper's next routing decision. One out-of-service event can cost more in lost freight and insurance treatment than in penalties. The driver was hired legally. The paperwork was in order at dispatch. The interpretation at the scale was different. Licensing eligibility standards tighten in 2026. The operative question is not whether the rules are reasonable, but who verifies compliance and when. A driver hired legally today can become unusable to a carrier without doing anything different. Officials describe it as safety-driven consistency. Carriers describe it as unpredictable capacity risk. Nothing about that gets settled at the scalehouse. The regulatory timeline ran from MAP 21 in 2012 through full electronic logging compliance in December 2019 and the hours of service revisions of 2020. Each phase tightened documentation. Each phase increased the cost of a mistake. A carrier who operates in multiple states navigates multiple interpretations. A driver who passes inspection in one state can fail in the next for the same credential. The freight still needs to move. The driver who can move it legally is the driver whose paperwork matches the interpretation at the next scale. A small carrier cannot afford a legal team to challenge every discretionary call. And in the last state on this list, the bill does not arrive at the scalehouse. It arrives on a payment schedule nobody can meet. Number 1. Washington. 6 in the morning at a Puget Sound terminal gate. 9 trucks in line. The tractor at the front is a 2021 model with 400,000 miles on it, and a replacement deadline attached to it by a rule that has nothing to do with what the freight is paying. The operators who survived the last 3 years did so mostly by not spending money. Deferred trades, deferred hiring, deferred everything. Container volumes shift between gateways for reasons no local operator controls. Puget Sound drayage. Equipment and emissions. Requirements set a date by which a tractor must be replaced, regardless of what the lane earns. A capital decision on a revenue stream that may move to another port. The carrier commits to a truck. The shipper commits to nothing. Shipment volumes remain below 2019 benchmarks. The freight that exists moves at rates set by the carrier, willing to operate at the thinnest margin. The result is not bankruptcy, so much as slow decapitalization. Older trucks, thinner reserves. A business that runs out of room to absorb the next thing. The truck still runs. The freight still moves. The operator earns less each year for the same work. A carrier who bought a truck in 2021 with cheap credit now faces a 2026 replacement requirement with no credit and no margin. The freight does not care. The regulation does not adjust. The operator absorbs the gap. The drivers are still working. The carriers they work for are slowly disappearing. A carrier who defers a trade today defers it again next year. And a carrier who defers long enough is not a carrier anymore. 8 states, 8 different bills for the same weak market. Indiana charges a driver for geography because the freight arrives in places nobody zoned a place to sleep. Ohio charges him for the receiver's calendar, in hours that are logged precisely and paid for barely. Michigan charges him for someone else's production schedule, on equipment he committed and cannot uncommit. Missouri charges him for a load he never touched through a deductible and a year of proving a negative. South Carolina charges him for accepting good news in payments that outlive the surge that justified them. Florida charges him for other people's verdicts, one renewal quote at a time. Arkansas charges him for an interpretation at a scalehouse that his paperwork did not anticipate. Washington charges him for a deadline written by people who never asked what the freight pays. None of it looks like a collapse from the outside. The tonnage still moves. The trucks are still on the road. The employment numbers hold. That is what makes it hard to argue with. There is no single event to point at. There is a margin that gets thinner every year, and a growing number of operators who cannot say yes to the next requirement, whatever it turns out to be. The question is not whether the freight keeps moving. It will. The question is, who is left owning the trucks that move it? So tell me what you are seeing. Which of these 8 bills landed on your operation first, and what did it cost you?